The soft, rhythmic click of the light mechanism remains the only clock the keeper truly trusts. It is a slow, methodical sound that anchors the deep silence. Listen closely, and you can almost feel the dampness of the sea spray clinging to the thick granite walls even 100 years later. We are moving back now, into the high-ceilinged, echoing heart of an isolated structure, where the great glass lantern turns its patient beam across the water. This is the keeper's world. We often imagine the lighthouse keeper as a stoic, romantic figure, standing against the tempest, a lone hero in an oilskin coat. But the reality, buried deep in the yellowing logbooks and faded service records, reveals something far quieter and far more challenging: the deep blue solitude. It was a world defined not by sudden drama, but by relentless, unchanging routine and the profound absence of other human voices. The true enemy was not the storm itself, but the stillness that followed, the days stretching out like an endless horizon. Imagine the smell inside the tower, a complex blend of polished brass, mineral oil, the salty bite of the air pulled in through the vent, and always, faintly, the lingering scent of burnt wick from hours past. The floorboards, scrubbed clean countless times, would give a low, sympathetic creak underfoot as the keeper made his rounds. This quiet soundtrack was often the most vibrant part of the day. The lighthouse itself was a machine of precision, and the keeper was its devoted servant. Every hour demanded attention, winding the mechanism, trimming the wicks, polishing the lens until it could capture the faintest light and magnify it into a life-saving beam. These were meditative, repetitive tasks. The hand moving over the brass felt the cold metal beneath the rough calluses of work. In this forced rhythm, the mind was left to drift. It is in this drift that the real tension lies, not the tension of an incoming ship, but the tension of the silent alarm of isolation. The human brain, designed for connection and novelty, was starved of both. Time became viscous and strange. A week could feel like a single long day. A day could feel like a season. The vast, repetitive sound of the waves, the constant sigh and pull of the ocean, acted less like music and more like a ceaseless, gentle interrogation of the mind. Think about the distance. On a remote, wave-swept rock, the nearest human conversation could be miles away, and sometimes months away. The only faces were those of family, if they were lucky enough to have them there, or the reflection staring back from the perfectly polished lens. Did they ever mistake that clean reflection for a sudden, unexpected visitor? This internal life, this slow battle against the self-inflicted quiet, is what the archival records only hint at. We see the official entries. Winds N&W light clean. 14 whales passed. But we do not see the entry that reads, spoke to the cat for 40 minutes about the nature of time. The keeper's world was a small circle of light against an immense, indifferent darkness. The tower's walls offered physical protection, but the true vulnerability was psychological. A small foghorn blast, when it came, was almost a relief, a sudden interruption to the oppressive stillness. But mostly it was the sound of the light itself. That gentle, persistent whir as the great lens rotated, sweeping the darkness away only to invite it back seconds later. The lighthouse board, the powerful, distant entity that governed these lives, understood this mental peril. They knew that a keeper's sanity was just as important to navigation as the quality of the oil he burned. Yet the remedies were often clinical and impersonal. The official regulations strictly controlled leave, supplies, and communications. They were masters of logistics, but strangers to the human heart. One particular regulation, now forgotten, demanded that keepers record the exact weight of every item they received in their annual supply drop, a strange request that masked a deeper purpose. This is where the story shifts. The keepers themselves, those quiet men and women trapped between the rock and the dark, had to devise their own defenses. They needed more than their routine. They needed a connection, a window to a world that wasn't solely defined by wind and wave. They needed nourishment for the mind, something to break the hypnotic cycle of the light and the dark. The silent alarm of isolation required a specific, specialized kind of antidote, one that the distant, bureaucratic board only provided in the most unassuming of forms. The records show the Lighthouse board did send supplies, cans of dried goods, tools, spare parts. But they also sent something else, something small, heavy, and infinitely more valuable than oil. They sent boxes. And within those wooden, sometimes salt-stained boxes, was the only real weapon against the solitude. The wooden boxes arrived with the annual tenders, the supply boats that navigated the treacherous coastal waters. They were unassuming containers, marked usually with a simple stenciled number and the cryptic initials, USLHB for the United States Lighthouse Board. These initials held the keys not just to the keeper's physical survival, but to his psychological defense. Unpacking the supplies was a ritual. The inventory had to be meticulous, an obligation enforced by the distant bureaucracy. Tins of kerosene, sacks of beans, replacement wicks, and, at the very bottom, often cushioned by straw or burlap, the library box. The keeper would lift the heavy, dense container, feeling the shift of the books inside, a low, satisfying thud that was the sound of immediate relief. The true weight of that box was its promise of intellectual migration. It was a ticket out of the granite confines, a temporary escape from the constant, watchful presence of the sea. For the keeper, the physical light he tended kept ships from striking the rocks. The intellectual light contained in those wooden boxes kept him from striking the rocks of his own mind. Think about the psychological effect of this scarcity. Unlike modern life, where 1,000 books are instantly available on a single screen, the keeper had 50, sometimes 60, hard-won volumes. He knew the rough texture of the cloth bindings of those books intimately. He could recognize the distinct smell of the paper and ink mingling with the inevitable sea air, a smell that signaled both knowledge and home. He would handle them with an almost sacred care, knowing that these particular stories, these specific essays, might be the only new information he encountered for a full year. How many keepers read the same worn copy of Moby Dick on 3 different nights, simply to revisit the familiar rhythm of the language? This deep, repeated engagement with the text was a form of mental fortification. The outside world was chaos and motion. The book was order and stability. The archival records, though sparse on personal reflection, sometimes offer glimpses into this deep connection. In the corners of otherwise dry inventory reports, one might find a note, received box 12B, wife requesting immediate access to the poetry volume. Or, the volume on mechanical arts proved most timely. The winding gear is fixed. These tiny, almost accidental disclosures confirm that the books were not mere distractions. They were tools for survival, education, and domestic harmony. The isolation was not just geographic. It was informational. The world was changing rapidly in the late 19th century, yet the keeper saw only the unchanging rotation of the stars. The books were his slow-motion newspaper, his window onto the great technological, political, and philosophical shifts happening just beyond the horizon. It is in the archived Lighthouse Board circulation lists that we find the curious pattern. The lists themselves were fascinating. A mix of practical engineering manuals, contemporary novels, religious texts, and surprisingly, advanced scientific treatises. The board was committed to keeping its keepers educated, seeing intellectual stimulation as a form of professional training. But researchers noticed a peculiar blank space in the ledgers. Over decades, across dozens of different stations, One common type of book, easily obtainable and highly popular on the mainland, was conspicuously absent from the circulating library. This genre was deliberately excluded. This official oversight was perhaps the quietest acknowledgement of the psychological dangers they faced. They knew that sometimes to save a man's mind, you had to control the story he was allowed to read. But no one knew exactly why that specific genre was banned. The fear of the Lighthouse Board was subtle yet absolute. What was it about those stories, those simple narratives of everyday life, that made them a profound threat to the solitude of the deep blue? The answer lies waiting within the next archival layer, in the specific titles and requests found in the dusty logbooks. The heart of this quiet historical mystery lies within the ink and weather of the official logbooks. These documents, meant to record purely meteorological and maintenance details, became accidental archives of the human spirit. The keeper's daily entry was dry, light working fine, winds 10 knots, barometer steady. But often on the reverse of a page, or scribbled in the margin after a particularly challenging year, were the small, essential requests for the next tender drop. These requests are where the archival detective work truly begins. We are not looking for grand declarations, but for the quiet, repetitive pattern of human longing. One keeper in North Carolina, isolated for 6 months by severe winter storms, repeatedly requested books on gardening and agriculture. Why? Because the sea was too vast, too powerful. He needed to read about earth roots and slow, predictable growth, an intellectual tether to the steady mainland that countered the liquid chaos surrounding his tower. Another keeper on the Pacific coast, according to a marginal note in his 1888 ledger, asked specifically for volumes of German philosophy and Latin poetry. This was a man using the solitude not just to survive, but to profoundly educate himself. The quiet, monotonous clang of the Fresnel lens mechanism became the metronome for his deepest contemplation. He had turned his lighthouse into a vertical sea-girt university. But it is the circulation lists compiled by the Lighthouse Board headquarters in Staten Island, New York, that hold the most telling clues. These lists show what was actually shipped out to the different districts. They reveal the silent selector, the unknown librarian or clerk who decided which 50 souls in those remote towers would receive Dante, and which would receive a book on steam engines. Imagine the weight of this responsibility. This distant, perhaps lonely librarian held the power to shape the entire intellectual world of a keeper for a year. The decisions were deliberate, designed to maintain a delicate mental balance. They had to provide comfort, but not too much comfort. They had to provide education, but not lead the isolated mind into dangerous flights of fancy. It is here that the subtle irony emerges. The Lighthouse Board, being a government body focused on engineering and safety, heavily favored technical manuals and practical instruction. A keeper was always well supplied with texts on hydraulics, optical physics, and boiler repair. Yet, historians who study the marginalia, the faint pencil marks, the tiny dog ears on the corner of a page, notice something peculiar. The most heavily read, most deeply annotated, and most frequently replaced books were not the technical manuals. They were the narrative histories and the cheap fiction novels. The official record stressed the importance of the professional texts, but the human record, etched in pencil on the soft paper of a well-loved novel, proves otherwise. The keepers were required to keep the lamp lit, but they seemed more desperate to keep the story going. In this high-stakes practical world of brass and glass, why did the simple pleasure of an invented story prove to be the most vital piece of survival equipment? The answer is simple yet profoundly human. The technical manuals connected them to their job. The fiction connected them to humanity. The gentle archival investigation reveals that the true work of the keeper was not just maintaining the light for others, but maintaining the inner light for himself. And for that, he needed the quiet escape offered by a stranger's carefully chosen box of books. As the years drifted by, marked only by the repetitive cycle of the tides and the occasional sound of the tender's low, mournful whistle, the library boxes became part of the family history. For the keeper's wife and children, the arrival of the new books was the most exciting event of the year. A sudden, vibrant burst of the outside world delivered right to their isolated doorstep. Imagine a small, windswept room near the base of the tower, designated as the family living space. The only sounds would be the gentle hiss of the oil lamp and the distant swoosh of the light sweeping past the window. In this small, intimate space, the books were shared, studied, and fought over. The Lighthouse Board's intent may have been to sustain the keeper's sanity, but the library often provided the intellectual ballast for the entire family unit. The archival evidence reveals the quieter, non-official stories. In one historical society's collection, there is a single, fragile letter sent by a keeper's daughter in 1902. She describes how she learned geometry not from a formal classroom, but from a textbook found in box 14A, using the circular staircase of the lighthouse itself to visualize the concepts. Her education was an accidental product of bureaucratic logistics. The library, intended as a defense against isolation, became an unintentional remote schoolhouse, microhook, the unexpected secret of the margins. It is fascinating to note how the books carried the silent echoes of the previous reader. These circulating collections were constantly being sent out, used for a year, then returned to Staten Island, cleaned, inventoried, and sent back out to another isolated station. A book read by a keeper in Maine in 1895 might find its next reader in the Florida Keys in 1897. What quiet messages, what secret emotions did they pass on? We often find small, almost invisible clues. A pencil underline marking a particularly resonant passage about solitude or resilience. A faint fingerprint smudge on a page that dealt with faraway city life. Or perhaps a tiny dried sprig of seaweed pressed between the pages of a novel. These are the archival whispers of lives lived intensely, yet apart. One persistent, though unsubstantiated, anecdote speaks of a copy of Tennyson's poetry, discovered years later with a handwritten note in the margin. The note, scribbled by a keeper who had suffered through a debilitating year of illness, read only, "Remember the sun." It was a small, quiet instruction passed from one lonely soul to the next, a profound piece of human solidarity, hidden within a state-sponsored library. Did the keeper who received that book years later recognize the quiet, desperate kinship of the previous reader? We can only assume the answer is yes. In that profound silence of the tower, every detail, every faint mark would have spoken volumes. The books, meant to connect them to the distant mainland, succeeded in connecting them to each other, across hundreds of miles and years of separation. This brings us back to the silent alarm of isolation. The books were not just entertainment. They were anchors. They provided proof that complex thought and vibrant life continued beyond the reach of the waves. The keepers knew their light was critical for others, but the library was critical for them. It was the only part of their annual supply drop that fed the soul instead of the body. The gentle, hypnotic rhythm of the light continues its work, sweeping its beam across the dark water. The books have long been packed away, the libraries dissolved, and the keepers replaced by automated systems. But the quiet story of their intellectual survival, the story of how 50 carefully chosen volumes could save a life from the encroaching darkness, remains, preserved in the ink and weather of the archival record. The air in the archives is always cool, carrying the faint, dry scent of aging paper and forgotten ink. Listen closely, and you might hear the silence of 100 years passing, the hush that surrounds important but unsung history. We are looking not at the heroic drama of the lighthouses, but at the quiet mechanics that made those lives possible. Our focus rests on a particular set of documents, the annual reports of the U.S. Lighthouse Board from the 1870s. Bureaucracy is often seen as cold and unfeeling, a machine of endless forms and impersonal mandates. Yet sometimes within the dry, technical language of an official report, a faint spark of human empathy can be found. The birth of the Lighthouse Library System was one such spark, a surprisingly compassionate response to the psychological dangers of deep blue solitude. The board, headquartered miles away in the bustling, clamorous city, received letters from their most isolated employees. These were not complaints about salary or supplies. They were subtle, sometimes veiled expressions of mental distress. A keeper might write about the monotony of the weather reports or the unsettling silence when the fog lifted. They described the wear of routine, the way the world shrank down to the size of the glass lantern they tended. The sound of the wind was constant, but the sound of intellectual engagement was missing. The engineers and naval officers who ran the Lighthouse Board were practical men. They did not deal in philosophy, they dealt in safety, efficiency, and light output. But they recognized that a lonely mind was an unreliable mind. An unreliable mind could lead to a dimmed lamp or a missed winding of the clockwork mechanism. Their decision to create a library system was, therefore, not simply a kindness, but a critical, preventative measure for maritime safety. Sanity, in the eyes of the board, was an essential component of the navigational beam. The official paperwork begins around 1876, listing a small appropriation under general maintenance and improvement. It was a quiet item, buried beneath figures for replacement lenses and the cost of whale oil. It authorized the purchase of 500 volumes to be distributed along the coasts. This was the unassuming birth of a revolutionary idea, the concept of circulating culture to the most remote corners of the nation. But who was the unknown individual who first presented this idea? The official records only detail the decision, never the compassionate source. Was it a librarian who understood the hunger for books? Or perhaps a naval captain who had personally witnessed the vacant stare of a keeper who hadn't spoken to a new face in 6 months? The faded ink of the initial proposal holds the names of the committee members, but the single person who penned the argument remains a fascinating, quiet historical phantom. The system established was wonderfully, simply complex. Books were purchased in large lots stamped with the USLHB circulating library mark, and organized into specific boxes, usually 50 volumes each. These boxes were then designated for a particular district. When the supply tender arrived at a station, it would exchange the old box for a fresh one. The cycle meant that every book was always moving. Every spine had a story of isolation and travel. The whole process was meticulously tracked on large, ledger-style sheets. The pages are now brittle, the paper cool to the touch, but you can still trace the movement of Box 4C from its initial delivery in New York to a tower in Massachusetts, and then a station in the Great Lakes years later. Each journey of the box was a journey of the mind, a silent promise of new stories in different worlds. The administration of this new library fell, fittingly, to a department within the board that was already focused on logistics, the supply depot. This ensured that the movement of the books was treated with the same precision and seriousness as the movement of kerosene and spare clockwork gears. The book box was given a numerical designation and tracked relentlessly, its whereabouts considered critical to the efficient operation of the station it served. This focus on bureaucratic efficiency masked a profound human effect. The act of packaging 50 books, a mix carefully chosen to satisfy both the professional and the personal curiosity of the keeper, was a small, invisible act of care. The librarians and clerks working in the dry, quiet warehouses became the unseen curators of the keeper's inner lives. Did the clerk in New York ever pause, holding a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, and wonder about the keeper in Oregon who would read it months later? Did they imagine the wind and the salt, the lonely hours illuminated by the beam? The records do not say, but the meticulous care in the packing suggests a degree of silent professional respect for the enormous sacrifice demanded by the job. The selection process was initially overseen by a rotating committee of board members, all attempting to balance the needs of education, diversion, and moral uplift. They avoided books that might be considered frivolous, preferring volumes that fostered self-improvement and practical knowledge. This initial list reveals a historical snapshot of what the 19th century establishment considered a safe and productive mind. However, as the system matured, the selections loosened, yielding to the insistent demand for narrative escape. This quiet shift in the purchasing ledgers, from engineering tracks to popular fiction, is the archive's most subtle reveal. The board tacitly acknowledged that technical competence alone was insufficient. The profound boredom and isolation required the stronger medicine of imagination and story. The annual reports, otherwise filled with statistics about lens types and fog signal distances, occasionally mention the weight of the library boxes. This seemingly irrelevant detail is, in fact, crucial. The boxes were deliberately designed to be substantial, to convey the physical importance of their contents. The tender crew, tasked with hauling the box up the narrow, often rain-slicked steps of the tower, could literally feel the weight of culture and connection. The keeper, signing the stiff receipt paper, acknowledged not just the books, but the commitment of the distant government to his well-being. This physical exchange, the heavy, damp box for the year-old read-through box, was the keeper's most profound moment of external human contact. It was a tangible link to the world he protected but could not easily inhabit. When the keeper lifted the new box, did he ever feel the ghost weight of the previous reader's solitude, knowing that another soul was waiting for his own finished books to arrive? The books became carriers of an emotional current, silent conduits of a shared, specialized loneliness. The Lighthouse Board was a quiet bureaucracy, dealing in the hard facts of the sea. But in the creation of these circulating libraries, they inadvertently created a system that distributed not just knowledge, but empathy. They recognized that the most dangerous hazard on the coast was not the hidden shoal, but the hidden emptiness in the long, dark hours between the light's hypnotic cycles. This system, born from an entry in a ledger, was the official antidote to the deep blue solitude, and it sets the stage for the secrets found in the actual books themselves. The system was designed to be robust, yet it relied entirely on human logistics. The books, once prepared at the depot, began their slow coastal migration. Imagine the process. The tender ship, the low, steady rumble of its engine providing a rare break in the ocean soundscape, would approach the isolated tower. The crew, accustomed to handling heavy, impersonal machinery, would carefully transfer the fragile, precious cargo of books. The damp canvas bag containing the new box would be hauled up by rope and pulley, treated with more caution than a barrel of fresh water. In the official reports, the transport of the libraries is always described in neutral, quantifiable terms. Box 18A transferred from Tender Violet to Station 34, Cape Hatteras, in good order. But the human drama of that transfer, the quick, shared laughter between the keeper and the crewman who briefly handled the box, the snatched 20 seconds of conversation about the contents is lost to the archives. Yet this small fleeting contact was the lifeblood of the system. The sheer scale of the operation is quietly remarkable. The system expanded rapidly, covering every navigable coast and the vast expanse of the Great Lakes. Hundreds of individual libraries, comprising thousands of volumes, were in perpetual motion, circling the continental edge. This was, in its own unsung way, one of the largest state-sponsored circulating libraries of the era, dedicated to a population of fewer than 2,000 people. The system, however, was not flawless. The greatest enemy of the circulating book was not the keeper, but the sea itself. Logbooks frequently record books lost to heavy weather, washed overboard during transfers, or ruined by salt-laden air that seeped into even the most carefully sealed boxes. In the archives, one can find a detailed loss report from 1891, documenting the total destruction of Box 54D off the coast of California. It lists the lost titles: A History of Ancient Greece, a volume of Emerson, and a novel by Hawthorne. The report estimates the monetary cost to the board, but it can never estimate the intellectual loss to the keeper who had waited a year for that particular collection. Was the loss of a known book more devastating than the continued silence of the tower? The keepers never complained formally about losses. It was understood that the sea claimed its due, but the subsequent entries in their personal records often show a heightened level of melancholy, or a sudden, obsessive focus on routine, perhaps a quiet reflection of the missing intellectual lifeline. The Lighthouse library system stands as a beautiful historical paradox. It was a massive logistical undertaking, administered with cold bureaucratic precision, yet its purpose was entirely emotional and deeply human. It proved that sometimes the most compassionate action a government can take is not to build monuments or pass grand laws, but simply to deliver a new story to a soul in desperate need of one. The unassuming birth of this system, recorded in the dry, brittle pages of old reports, ensured that the solitude of the keeper was never total. The soft sound of turning pages was the quietest, most effective fog signal against the silent alarm of isolation. The journey of these books continues in our quiet historical investigation, moving now to the specific titles and secrets found within the boxes themselves. The silence within the lighthouse is never truly silent. There is the whisper of the wind against the thick glass, the low groan of the iron structure settling, and the rhythmic, patient tick-tock of the lamp mechanism. Now let your mind settle on the keeper's small, orderly desk, illuminated by a gentle kerosene lamp. On that desk sits a single important piece of paper, the inventory of the year's new library box. The title of this box, usually marked with a simple number or a district code, contained the list of 50. This wasn't a casual reading list. It was an annual allotment, a calculated dose of culture designed to last 365 days. The reason for this scarcity, why a new box of books was an annual event, and not a monthly shipment, tells us a profound story about logistics, respect, and the human capacity for savoring. In the era of the circulating lighthouse libraries, the act of shipping was an immense challenge. Tenders faced treacherous waters, unpredictable storms, and the vast, unyielding scale of the American coastline. Every transfer of goods to an offshore station was a risk, a complex operation involving pulleys, small boats, and the constant damp threat of the ocean. A shipment of 50 pounds of coal was vital. A shipment of 50 pounds of paper was considered a luxury only justifiable once a year. But the scarcity was not solely a matter of logistics. It was also a subtle, almost unconscious psychological strategy. The Lighthouse Board understood that abundance bred indifference. To supply books too frequently would dilute their value and transform them from tools of survival into mere distractions. By limiting the influx to an annual event, They ensured that the contents of that wooden box maintained their precious, life-sustaining status. Think of the anticipation. For months after the tender left, the previous year's books would be read, reread, and exhausted. The keeper and his family would scan the horizon, waiting for the first sight of the ship's distant dark plume of smoke. The arrival meant not only fresh food and oil, but a completely new intellectual landscape. It meant the world had moved on, and they were finally catching up. The unpacking of the list of 50 was not a hurried task. It was a ceremony. The keeper would sign the receipt, noting the damp chill of the boxwood, and then carefully cut the hemp rope or pull out the small nails holding the lid secure. The family would gather, and the official work of the inventory would begin. The keeper would read the titles aloud, checking them off against the printed list provided by the board. The sound of the unfamiliar names, Dickens, Verne, Emerson, would echo in the small, stone-walled room, transforming the isolated space into a temporary hub of global thought. Every volume was treated with exquisite care, knowing that this set of 50 must provide the mental sustenance until the light turned again and a full year had passed. How did the keeper and his family decide which book would be read first? Was the decision a democratic vote? Or did the isolation give the keeper the absolute authority over the literary queue? We can only imagine the quiet, intense negotiations that must have occurred over the rights to the newest adventure novel versus the most anticipated science text. The annual scarcity sharpened their intellectual hunger and forced a level of appreciation unknown to those on the mainland. The annual box was not just 50 books. It was 50 carefully curated doorways, each promising a room entirely unlike the tower. The key to understanding the list of 50 lies in the archival selection criteria. The Lighthouse board, being practical above all, divided the contents into distinct measured categories. Imagine a quiet, orderly inventory list from the 1880s. 10 volumes, technical and professional. Texts on optics, steam, naval architecture, and coastal geology. Essential reading for their duties. Volumes. General knowledge and self-improvement. Histories of the world. Geography. Famous biographies and essays by American thinkers to maintain intellectual curiosity. And volumes. General literature, contemporary and classic novels, poetry and drama, the bulk of the system, designed purely for escape and narrative immersion. Volumes. Juvenilia, domestic, books for the keeper's family, if present, or texts on gardening and simple home crafts, a concession to domestic life. This careful balance reveals a fascinating historical perspective on the psychology of isolation. The board was not just sending books. They were attempting to engineer an entire year of intellectual activity. They recognized that the mind required a varied diet. It needed the solidity of fact and the buoyancy of fiction in equal measure. The scarcity of the annual delivery meant that the books were not merely read, but studied. The keeper would often turn to the technical manuals repeatedly, not just when a piece of machinery broke, but as a preventative measure, an obsessive need to master every aspect of their isolated domain. He would feel the smooth, stiff pages of the technical texts, a sensory reminder of his vital professional duty. Consider the value placed on a single volume of poetry within the list of 50. These were not lengthy, dense collections, but small, often pocket-sized books. Yet they offered a unique defense against the monotony of the deep blue. A novel might take days to read. A single poem could be committed to memory and then recited endlessly during the long, dark watches. How many keepers stood in the lantern room, the great light slowly turning, and repeated a few lines of Tennyson or Longfellow, using the poetry to fill the immense silent space around them? The archives hint that these simple verses were the most portable, most resilient form of intellectual defense. They were books that could be closed, internalized, and carried on the lonely rounds. The fact that the delivery was annual meant that the keeper had to become a master of rationing. There was no quick replacement for a dull book, no easy substitution for a topic that failed to engage. The keeper's eye would scan the bookshelf, considering which new world to open next, knowing that each choice consumed a precious, non-renewable resource of the mind. The list of 50 became a schedule, a rhythm for the lonely year. The excitement of the initial unpacking gave way to the slow, measured consumption of the contents until finally, only a few titles remained, the books perhaps saved for the most challenging weather, the deepest part of winter, or the most profound stretches of silence. The books that were left unread were the ones that failed to meet the intense requirements of life lived at the edge of the world. The profound significance of the list of 50 was that it acted as a psychological timeline. The keeper had to project his intellectual needs across 365 days. If he devoured the most compelling fiction in the first month, he risked facing the remaining 11 months with only technical manuals and philosophical essays, a difficult prospect when the fog rolled in for weeks on end. This forced rationing led to a quiet, sophisticated kind of reading. The books were read slowly, deliberately. A single chapter might be enough for a night. Its events replayed and analyzed during the long, repetitive hours of the day. The keeper would trace the faint indentations of the print with his finger, drawing out the mental sustenance for as long as possible. This was reading as meditation, reading as self-control. In one archival interview conducted with a retired keeper from the 1930s, he recalled the feeling of holding a new book from the annual box. It wasn't just a story, sir. It was 3 weeks of good silence. It was the feeling that for 3 weeks you weren't standing on a rock. You were in London, or on Mars. His description highlights the unique function of these 50 books. They were carefully measured doses of portable, controlled escape. The inventory process was supposed to be simple. Check off the received books and sign. But some keepers, knowing the immense value of their annual box, began keeping their own private inventory. Hidden within the flyleaves of their official logbooks, or sometimes scribbled on spare, weather-worn pieces of parchment, they recorded their personal ranking of the books. One such secret list, discovered tucked into the bottom of a supply barrel decades later, assigned a simple star rating to each of the 50 titles. We see 5 stars next to Tennyson's poems and only 1 star next to a volume titled Elementary Mechanics of the Screw. This personal record reveals the truth that the bureaucracy often missed. The books that offered the greatest emotional connection were the true heroes of the Lighthouse library system. What quiet, unspoken rebellion did this private inventory represent against the official list approved by the board? It suggests that the keeper's mind was still entirely his own, capable of discerning intellectual nourishment from professional duty. He was grateful for the books, but he maintained his right to judge their worth in the context of his isolation. The annual nature of the delivery amplified the sense of intellectual responsibility. If a book was dull, the keeper felt the loss of that potential escape keenly. If a book was brilliant, it became a companion, a voice against the constant hollow sound of the horn. The list of 50 transformed into a calendar of internal experiences, marking the year not by the seasons or the holidays, but by the completion of a cherished volume. The scarcity ensured that every page counted, every word mattered. The memory of the annual arrival, the damp wooden scent of the box, the thrilling sound of the new titles, would sustain them through the next cycle of wind and water. This quiet ritual of the list of 50 remains one of the most compelling, human aspects of the vast cold bureaucracy that lit the American coast. Close your eyes now, and let us move past the rough, salty texture of the wooden boxes and into the still, temperature-controlled environment of the National Archives. Here the air holds the dry, cool scent of parchment and the distant memory of ink. We are searching for something specific, the actual handwritten requests made by the lighthouse keepers themselves. This is where the catalog's hum begins. The soft, collective voice of hundreds of isolated readers, reaching out through the decades. The Lighthouse Board, in its thorough bureaucracy, maintained detailed ledgers. These ledgers, now bound and brittle, contain the official records of books received and books requested. Turning these faintly yellowed pages, marked with the official stamp of the USLHB, we find entries that were meant to be mundane, but which now read like intimate glimpses into the keeper's soul. The typical entry would list the station name, the date, and then, under the column marked Special Request, the keeper's precise, deliberate choice. This request was a gamble. It might take months for the board to locate and approve the specific title, but it was also an act of profound hope, the keeper's single annual attempt to shape his own intellectual fate. The requests were often surprising. We might expect demands for thrilling adventure novels, a quick, easy escape from the mundane, but the archives reveal a deeper, more sophisticated intellectual hunger. Keepers frequently asked for texts on philosophy, advanced mathematics, and complex scientific theories. They were not simply trying to pass the time. They were trying to improve the time to use the vast, enforced silence of the tower as an unparalleled opportunity for self-education. Imagine the keeper, completing his 12 hours of watch, his mind still alert from tending the light, sitting down to tackle a difficult text on celestial navigation or early American history. The distant rhythmic wash of the waves outside would be the only distraction from the dense, challenging text. This dedication suggests that solitude did not diminish their intellect. For many, it amplified it. The records also reveal a pattern of requests for books on subjects that seem wildly out of place in a lighthouse. There is a persistent demand for volumes on banking, economics, and international trade. Why would a man whose world was defined by granite and glass care about the workings of Wall Street? The answer lies in the psychological fear of being forgotten. The books on finance and commerce were their only window into the engine of the mainland. Proof that the complex world they were helping to navigate was still in motion. They needed to know the civilization they were protecting was thriving. The hum of the catalog was not just the sound of reading, it was the sound of a desperate attempt to stay relevant. Did the keeper truly believe he might return to the mainland and utilize his knowledge of commodities? Or did the reading itself simply provide the vital sense of continued participation? This quiet craving for complex worldly knowledge is a subtle reminder of the profound intellectual struggle waged within the silent walls of the tower. The most poignant entries are not the grand requests, but the small domestic ones. The keeper in Michigan asking for a book on flower pressing for his young daughter, or the one in Maine requesting a volume of simple songs for his wife's quiet hours. These requests show the quiet, immense effort required to maintain a sense of normal family life against the vast, eroding presence of the ocean. The keeper was a lighthouse for his family as much as he was for the ships, and the books were the only fuel for that domestic light. As we continue to pore over the Lighthouse Board's ledgers, the catalog's hum grows louder, revealing the distinct personalities behind the routine. Each requested text is a clue, a deliberate choice reflecting months of quiet consideration. We see the keeper in Oregon who focused intensely on geology and paleontology, perhaps finding a quiet, deep-time comfort in the unchanging nature of the rocks he stood upon. A counterpoint to the volatile ocean, his hands tired from polishing brass, found solace tracing the stiff illustrations of ancient fossils. Then there is the keeper near the Gulf of Mexico, who, year after year, requested nothing but biographies of inventors and explorers. He was a man consumed by the desire for motion and innovation, using the lives of restless men to counteract the enforced stillness of his own. These choices highlight a key psychological need of the isolated mind: the desperate search for intellectual movement when physical movement is denied. The Lighthouse Board, in an effort to maintain some control over the decentralized system, eventually compiled these popular requests into a single master list, a kind of archival bestseller catalog for the forgotten few. This document, now preserved, is a historical testament to the intellectual tastes of 19th century American isolation. It listed the books that were in highest demand, which included surprising staples like Plutarch's Lives and Tennyson's Idylls of the King, proving that the classics remained the most powerful defense against boredom. However, within the rows of meticulously recorded data, a peculiar pattern emerges, one that hints at a quiet human irregularity. A number of keepers across different districts and different years would submit a double request in the same category. For example, they might ask for 2 distinctly different, challenging philosophy texts or 2 thick volumes of obscure history. Why would a keeper, who knew the immense value of each spot on the list of 50, willingly double up on one subject, thereby sacrificing the opportunity for a different kind of intellectual escape? The subtle clue lies in the margin notes of the clerks at the supply depot. Sometimes, next to a doubled request, the clerk wrote the single word, shared. This indicates that the keeper was ordering one book for his own study and one for a relief keeper, or perhaps for another isolated soul at a nearby station, using the official system to facilitate an unofficial, secret literary exchange. This small act of sharing was a silent resistance against the official loneliness, an attempt to build a tiny private intellectual community in the vast, empty sea. The catalog's hum thus reveals a hidden network of intellectual generosity. The keeper's true work extended beyond the beam of the light. It included the quiet, unsung labor of maintaining human connection through the shared turning page. The books meant to tether the mind to the mainland ended up tethering keepers to each other. The reading of these forgotten requests brings a profound sense of historical empathy. We feel the deep, quiet concentration of the man on the rock, his mind striving for mastery, his eyes scanning the list for the single volume that might sustain him through the long winter watches. The list of 50 was his annual lifeline, and his request was his one moment to speak to the distant world he served. The true fascination of the catalog's hum is not simply what the keepers requested, but the vivid picture it paints of their internal struggle to balance the practical with the philosophical. On one page, a keeper requests a highly specific treatise on the metallurgy of early American lanterns, a necessity for his professional duty. Directly beneath it, however, is a plea for a complete set of Shakespeare's tragedies. He needed both the precise knowledge of metal structure and the profound, enduring structure of human emotion. This recurring juxtaposition reveals the sophisticated demands of the isolated mind. The technical manuals served as anchors, providing control and competence in a world defined by chaos. But the literature served as the necessary liberation, allowing the mind to stretch far beyond the confines of the granite walls and the damp, salty air they breathed. We find the evidence in the subtle wear patterns of the remaining books. The technical manuals, while essential, were often kept clean, stored neatly on the bottom shelf, handled with the clean stiffness of official duty. But the requested fiction and poetry show unmistakable signs of love: dog-eared corners, faded pencil underlines, the telltale ripple of pages read repeatedly by lamplight until dawn. The texture of these pages holds the tactile memory of the keeper's long, lonely hours. The requests, however, also serve to highlight a deeper, systemic control. Remember the hidden rule we glimpsed earlier? The single popular genre that was conspicuously absent from the circulating boxes? The requests made by the keepers for this forbidden material were consistently denied, quietly struck from the list by the silent selector at the supply depot. The banned books were often simple, popular works of contemporary domestic fiction, stories of ordinary families, city life, and the predictable rhythms of the mainland. The board was not concerned with morality. They were concerned with comparison. They feared that exposing the keepers to the easy, accessible comfort of normal life would make their profound isolation unbearable, triggering a rapid decline in morale and duty. Was the fear of the mundane, the knowledge of what they were missing, a greater threat to the keeper's sanity than the wildest tragedy, or the most complex physics text? The bureaucratic silence surrounding this ban speaks volumes. The catalog's hum proves that the keepers craved these simple stories, these assurances of a stable world. But the board, in a quiet, chilling act of psychological maintenance, denied them this gentle poison. The reading of the forgotten request records, therefore, is not a simple history lesson. It is an act of quiet witness. We are listening to the muffled voices of men and women who used paper and ink as their only connection to the vast civilization they worked tirelessly to protect. The catalog's hum eventually fades, leaving behind only the profound realization that in the most isolated places, a single, carefully chosen book could become the most essential piece of survival equipment. The mystery of the prohibited genre and the quiet defiance of the keepers who requested it will lead us to the next chapter, where we look closer at the individual who curated these critical collections. Let the gentle, rhythmic scratch of a fountain pen on thick paper guide us now. We are moving into the most intimate of the Lighthouse Board's records, the keeper's official logbooks. These were the mandatory day-to-day diaries of duty, intended only to record the cold facts of ink and weather, wind speed, fog duration, oil consumption. But sometimes, when the tender ship arrived, the boundary between official duty and personal life softened, allowing a quiet, human detail to slip onto the page. The official logbook entry for the tender's visit would typically be dry. Tender Mayflower alongside. Supplies transferred. Light operating satisfactorily. This was the mandated report written in the steady, functional hand of a man who dealt in facts. But for the watchful researcher, the subtle placement of the entry provides the greatest clue. Often, the log entry recording the arrival of the supply tender and the library box it carried would be written with a slightly darker, bolder ink, or perhaps the handwriting would show a fleeting, almost imperceptible looseness, betraying a moment of excitement that the official narrative tried to suppress. This small silent irregularity is the archival evidence of joy. The arrival of the new library box, after a year of isolation, was an event so significant that the keeper sometimes couldn't resist documenting it with a tiny, unofficial flourish. He was recording the precise moment that the flow of fiction and philosophy was restored to his life. A moment as vital as the delivery of fresh kerosene. Imagine the keeper, standing at his desk, the salt air gently cooling the ink as he writes. He records the direction of the wind and the state of the sea, the immutable facts of his environment. But then he adds a quiet note, perhaps a few lines lower, separated from the official record. Box 12C received. Contains new volume of Hawthorne. This small, specific mention elevated a novel from mere supplies to an event worthy of historical preservation. The logbooks, spanning decades and hundreds of stations, reveal that the keepers developed a quiet, shared language for documenting this important arrival. They often paired the description of the new books with the description of the immediate weather conditions. On days of harsh, choppy seas, the entry might read, "Heavy swell. Tender transfer difficult. Received box 4A. A welcome relief." The weather outside was recorded as dangerous, but the contents of the box promised intellectual safety. On days of gentle, clear skies, the entry might be more expansive. Clear visibility 20 miles, sun warm on the glass. Box 11B contains new books for the wife. The beautiful weather and the arrival of the books were equated. Both were gifts of grace, providing a momentary reprieve from the grinding routine. Did the keeper instinctively pair the arrival of fiction and philosophy with the weather, because these were the two most powerful, uncontrollable forces dictating the quality of his solitude? The pages themselves, with their spidery handwriting and occasional fingerprint smudges, suggest that the state of the elements and the state of the mind were intrinsically linked. In one particular logbook from a station in the stormy mid-Atlantic, a keeper's usually precise hand falters just once. He records the supplies accurately, but when describing the contents of the box, he accidentally omits a comma, writing, "Received box 7E new books," and the rain continues. That small, forgotten piece of punctuation silently binds the flow of words to the flow of water, revealing a keeper whose excitement about the books was equal to his weariness of the persistent downpour. The logbooks were intended to be dry bureaucratic tools, but they became the unwitting documentation of the human capacity for hope, recorded in the indelible language of ink and weather. The most compelling archival material found within the logbooks are the informal, non-mandated notes that occasionally appear beneath the official entries. These were the keeper's private thoughts, often written quickly before being crossed out or simply left to fade. They document not just the arrival of the books, but their immediate, profound impact. One such note, from a remote New England station in 1899, reads, "The new box 22A is full of great matter. The boy has already taken the volume of Moby Dick and sits by the small stove. The work is easier tonight." This small, fragmented sentence reveals the therapeutic power of the list of 50. It calmed the domestic environment, transforming the isolated tower from a place of intense duty to a place of shared, quiet intellectual activity. The hiss of the stove and the presence of the book created a temporary pocket of home, impervious to the storm outside. The logbooks document the consumption of the content through the lens of duty. For example, a keeper might note on a Tuesday, "Oiled clockwork, light mechanism clean, spent 3 hours reading treatise on the refraction of light." This transforms the act of reading a professional text into an extension of his maintenance duties. He was not reading for pleasure. He was reading to ensure the beam remained pure. However, the entries concerning fiction or philosophy possess a different tone entirely. They are often less specific, more reflective. A Friday entry might simply state, "Finished the novel from box 14B. Hard to return to the sea." This acknowledgement of the book's power to create a compelling alternative. Reality is the emotional core of the logbook, the recognition that fiction offered a temporary, necessary grief upon its completion. The cold, smooth brass railing of the tower would suddenly feel very real again. As we follow the path of the ink and weather, we notice that the keeper's handwriting itself changes over the course of the year. After the arrival of the new books, the script might be slightly more fluid, more engaged. But as the months pass and the books are exhausted, the handwriting often becomes more rigid, more repetitive, returning to the purely functional hand of duty. A subtle, silent sign that the mind is struggling against the confines of routine once more. The books were literally essential for maintaining the fluidity of the keeper's thought process. Could a careful analysis of the keeper's calligraphy throughout the year actually provide a psychological map of their solitude, charting their internal energy based on the availability of a new story? The subtle variations in pen pressure and spacing seemed to suggest that the state of the mind was being documented in a way the Lighthouse board never intended. In one highly damaged logbook, the final page of a long entry is completely missing, torn out roughly, but the remaining fragment of the preceding line is visible. It reads, "I cannot agree with Mr. Emerson's views on self-reliance in this." The rest of the thought is lost. This missing page is a powerful symbol of the intensity of their engagement. The keeper, isolated from any immediate intellectual sparring partner, engaged in a solitary, passionate argument with a philosopher, an argument so intense that it led to the physical destruction of the page. The logbooks, bound in their heavy, dark covers, are quiet testament to the intellectual warfare waged by the keepers against the encroaching stillness. They used the ink and weather to create a dual narrative, one of official duty for the board, and one of quiet, intellectual life for themselves. The philosophical questions and the fictional escapes they recorded ensured that while their bodies were trapped on the rock, their minds were perpetually free. The profound solitude of the keeper's life meant that the logbook often became more than a record of duty. It evolved into a subtle, unintended repository of emotional weathering. The precise lines dedicated to the ink and weather tell a story of intellectual resilience, or sometimes intellectual fatigue. Consider the entry for the return of the library box. The keeper was required to list the condition of the books being returned. This seemingly technical requirement often prompted a quiet, emotional reflection. If a favorite book was worn, its binding cracked from repeated reading, the keeper might write, "Returned box 19D, condition fair, given the weather." The subtle pairing of the book's wear with the wear of the elements suggests that the life of the book mirrored the life of the keeper. Both had survived a difficult year. The scent of salt and old paper clinging to the returned books was the archive's proof of profound engagement. The logbooks also document a quiet, profound form of historical irony. The keepers, isolated from all current events save those mentioned briefly in their books, often recorded historical moments from the mainland that seemed utterly trivial to their immediate life or death environment. They might meticulously record the arrival of a new volume of Emerson's essays on the same day they record an unprecedented 15-foot rogue wave that threatened the base of the tower. The profound and the philosophical coexisted with the professional hazard. In examining the supply requests recorded in the logbooks, a strange, persistent demand surfaces, an unusual need for extra blank paper. The official board policy provided paper for logs and official correspondence, but many keepers asked for several reams more than necessary. Why would a man surrounded by the vast, empty space of the ocean require extra blank paper when he already had 50 books full of stories and philosophy? The archival researchers suggest this paper was not for official use but for unwritten thoughts. The keeper, unable to speak his mind or fully internalize the powerful ideas he read, needed a clean, blank surface upon which to process the internal friction of his thoughts. He needed a place to copy poems, draft letters to the authors he admired, or perhaps simply write down the thoughts that the monotonous roar of the sea refused to quiet. The texture of the blank sheet offered a promise of control and self-expression absent in the rigid logbook. The logbooks, therefore, become a quiet testament to the enduring power of the written word, both the words of others and the words that demanded to be written down. The arrival of fiction and philosophy was not merely a delivery, it was a renewal of the inner life, documented in the language of ink and weather. The keeper's hand, steady and precise when recording the light's beam, trembled slightly when acknowledging the arrival of the stories that illuminated his soul. This quiet yet intense engagement with the texts ultimately led to the next stage of the library's life, the need for a dedicated, compassionate mind to select and manage these vital collections, a person who understood the silent language of the keeper's need better than the board itself. We leave the wind-swept silence of the tower and descend into the clamor of 19th century New York City, where the U.S. Lighthouse Board Supply Depot maintained its quiet, efficient operations. Here, amidst the hissing steam of nearby piers and the distant clatter of wagon wheels, sits the desk of the individual we call the silent selector. This person held one of the most unexpected and profound responsibilities in the entire federal service, curating the sanity of hundreds of isolated souls they would never meet. The selector was likely a civilian clerk, perhaps working in a small, orderly room far from the actual engineering and logistical bustle of the depot. Their world was defined by paper and precise labels, a stark contrast to the salty, volatile reality of the coast. On their desk lay stacks of incoming logbooks and brittle request forms, the handwritten pleas from keepers stationed on wave-swept keys off Florida or on remote capes in Oregon. The essential task was one of translation. The selector had to translate the cold, dry language of a remote request. Please provide volumes on the history of the Phoenicians and one volume of contemporary poetry into a psychological profile. They had to understand that the request for history was a request for perspective and distance, and the poetry was a request for compact, memorable beauty to ward off the soul-dulling monotony. The board's regulations dictated the categories of books to be sent, but the selector chose the specific titles. They were the quiet gatekeeper, deciding which 50 volumes would fill the annual box and sustain the mental health of a family for the next 12 months. Their power was immense, yet entirely unseen. Their influence measured only in the slow, quiet turning of pages thousands of miles away. Imagine this selector, whose hands were clean and smooth, never rough with salt or oil, holding a logbook covered in the faint, pervasive scent of salt and whale oil. This scent was their only sensory link to the world they served. It was a constant, subtle reminder that their choices mattered profoundly. A wrong selection, a book that was too depressing, too complex, or too irrelevant, could worsen a keeper's isolation. The selector did not know the keeper's face, but they knew his handwriting. They knew the tight, precise script of the older man who valued order, and the quick, sprawling cursive of the younger man craving adventure. The act of reading the request lists became a deeply personal form of historical research, a quiet attempt to discern the psychological state encoded in the loops and lines of the ink. Did the selector ever try to guess which handwriting belonged to the most restless soul? And did they intentionally send that person a particularly dense, challenging philosophy book to anchor their energy? It's a fascinating, unanswerable archival question. The job required both the bureaucratic precision of an accountant and the intuitive empathy of a counselor. The greatest psychological challenge for the silent selector was managing the tyranny of the annual schedule. They knew that once the box was sealed and sent, there was no possibility of correction or replacement for an entire year. The final click of the latch on the wooden box was a sound of finality, a quiet, absolute commitment to the mental sustenance contained within. We can assign a placeholder name to our silent selector. Let us call her Eleanor Vance. Eleanor never saw the sunrise over the Atlantic from a tower, but she saw it reflected in the polished glass and brass illustrations of the books she handled. Her main tool was not a pulley or a wrench, but a small, simple stamp bearing the insignia of the circulating library. This stamp was the bureaucratic seal that legitimized the book's journey into solitude. Eleanor's desk was piled high with the returned books, the ones that had already completed their annual cycle. She meticulously checked them for damage, noting the inevitable salt stains and the wear on the spine, which provided clues about their popularity. A loose, heavily underlined copy of a Gilded Age novel told her more about the keeper's psychological need for escapism than any official report could. Her primary interaction with the keepers was through the logbook's marginalia, while the official request was printed or copied onto a standard form. The subtle personal notes were often scrawled right inside the official log. A keeper might write, "Please avoid political texts this cycle. The isolation makes for too much thinking." Or, "My wife is requesting a book with good, clear pictures of flowers." Eleanor Vance, the quiet clerk in New York, became an expert interpreter of these veiled emotional requests. She understood that asking for a botany book was asking for an intellectual lifeline to the living world. Asking to avoid politics was asking for peace of mind. The sheer scale of the solitude forced the keeper to be honest, and Eleanor had to match that honesty with appropriate literary compassion. The hardest part of her work was processing the denied requests. We know from the archival records that the board systematically banned certain popular genres that focused on easily accessible domestic life. The keepers, craving a taste of the normal world they protected, often requested these very books. Eleanor, reading the carefully penned request for a simple, light-hearted novel about city manners, knew she had to deny it. She would take a fine, sharp pencil and draw a single, quiet line through the request, then substitute a volume of Sir Walter Scott's historical fiction, something equally engrossing, but safely distant from the painful reality of their current circumstance. Did Eleanor, sitting in the warm, bustling city, feel a surge of guilt when she denied a keeper the simple, harmless comfort of a domestic novel, knowing she was enforcing the board's clinical policy against mental comparison? This silent daily act of emotional control was the psychological core of her job. She wasn't denying a book. She was denying a dangerous truth. Her act of selection was a slow, meditative exercise. She would pull the new books from the vast storage shelves, feeling the smooth, unbroken texture of the fresh cloth covers. She organized them within the box, considering the visual weight and balance. A heavy history volume placed next to a lighter, more hopeful collection of essays. She was balancing the keeper's mind 50 volumes at a time. The faint rustle of the new pages was the sound of an intellectual horizon being expanded for a stranger. As Eleanor Vance continued her work, the boundary between her world and the keeper's world began to blur. She began to see the lighthouses not as dots on a navigational chart, but as small, distant reading lamps where her chosen books were performing their vital work. Her quiet connection to the keepers led to subtle, entirely unauthorized acts of human intervention. Her archival fingerprint left on the system. In one inventory list, researchers found a faint, illegible pencil mark next to the official count of 50 volumes. When the corresponding return list was checked, it showed that the keeper had actually returned 51 items. The single extra item was a small, unbound pamphlet on birdwatching, a subject never officially stocked or approved by the board. This single, quiet gesture reveals the selector's empathy. Eleanor likely knew the keeper was stationed near a migratory bird route, and she added the unrequested pamphlet as a private, small gift, a way to turn the keeper's gaze outward, encouraging a natural, calming observation that required no large intellectual investment. This act was a gentle breach of bureaucratic protocol, a quiet rebellion of the heart against the cold precision of the supply depot. The sensory details of the packing process further reveal this quiet dedication. While the official requirement was to use only burlap and straw as filler, evidence suggests that some boxes contained unauthorized materials, perhaps a single smooth piece of driftwood tucked into the corner, or a small bag of fresh-smelling coffee beans, providing a temporary, rich aroma upon opening. These weren't books, but they were comfort, small, terrestrial reminders of the world that loved and remembered them. Did the keepers, upon finding these small unauthorized comforts, understand that they had a quiet champion in the distant city, a guardian angel whose only tools were paper and ink? The fact that the keepers never reported these breaches of protocol suggests a silent, mutual understanding of the gift. Eleanor Vance knew the deep irony of her position. She was the one tethered to the mainland, surrounded by people. Yet her deepest emotional engagement was with the lives of people she had only encountered through the faded script of their handwriting. The sound of the city outside her window, the clatter, the shouts, the endless conversations, must have seemed chaotic compared to the deep, resonant silence of the towers she served. The selector's quiet labor was a form of historical midwifery. She helped give birth to the keeper's new internal world each year. She chose the materials that would shape his thinking, calm his restlessness, and engage his children. Her legacy is not found on a plaque, but in the collective mental fortitude of the keepers who maintained the light, one well-chosen story at a time. The final act of the silent selector was the sealing of the box. She would carefully place the finished list of 50 inside, ensuring the titles were cushioned against the inevitable journey. Before the lid was hammered shut, she would sometimes run her hand over the smooth, clean cloth bindings of the new volumes, a final, silent farewell before their year-long journey into solitude. The burden of enforcing the banned genre weighed heaviest during this final stage. Eleanor knew that the stories she excluded were sometimes as important as the histories she included. Her refusal to send the popular, light domestic novels was a painful act of psychological foresight, a cold administrative measure meant to save the keeper from the paralyzing grief of comparison. The heavy wooden lid that closed the box also closed off the painful vision of normal life. In the quiet moments after the delivery wagon rattled away from the supply depot, carrying her curated boxes toward the coast, did Eleanor ever wonder if she had chosen the right balance between necessary escape and harsh reality? Her work established a profound, silent relationship between the isolated keeper and the civilian selector, a relationship conducted entirely through the cold bureaucracy of paper lists and the warm intimacy of a shared story. The keeper, watching the tender disappear over the horizon, trusted that the distant world had provided him with the necessary mental armor. The historical record of Eleanor Vance, or whoever the silent selector may have been, ultimately fades back into the dry, cool silence of the archive. She remains a ghost in the bureaucracy, a powerful, compassionate mind who used books to anchor the most restless souls on the American coast. But the story of her quiet work leaves one final, lingering trace. Decades later, a retired Lighthouse board official reported that an old library box was discovered in a dusty basement. On the inside of the lid, where the nails secured the wood, there was a faint, almost invisible inscription, written in a delicate hand, a message left by the selector, meant only for the lonely eyes of the recipient. The light turns. There is a soft, continuous whirring sound from the clockwork mechanism, a noise so constant it becomes the auditory wallpaper of the tower. We are now standing in the deepest quiet of the lighthouse, the late hours, the longest watches, when the mainland sleeps and the keeper is entirely alone with his duties and his thoughts. This is the setting for a study in shadows. The keeper's routine demanded vigilance, but the darkness demanded solitude. The official night watch, Stretching from midnight until dawn was a vast, quiet expanse. The only immediate illumination came from the focused intensity of the lamp itself, casting long, dramatic shadows across the winding stairwell and the small personal space near the base. It was in these shadows that the reading truly happened. The keeper would sit on a sturdy wooden stool, often positioning himself just outside the direct, blinding glare of the light, relying on a low-burning auxiliary oil lamp or the faint, reflected illumination from the polished brass. The air would be cool and damp, carrying the scent of kerosene and salt. The book in his hands would be his primary company, a silent, patient conversationalist during hours when human dialogue was impossible. What did they read during these endless hypnotic watches? The archival evidence suggests that the selection was often driven by the unique psychological pressure of the moment. These were not hours for light diversion. These were hours for deep, anchoring thought. The most popular books for the longest watches were often dense, narrative histories, the detailed chronicles of ancient civilizations, the slow, methodical buildup of great empires. The sheer scale and complexity of these works acted as a powerful counterweight to the immediate smallness of the keeper's existence. He could lose himself in the sweep of centuries, transforming his brief, isolated watch into a brief, privileged viewpoint from the mountain of time. Another popular choice was geography and ethnography, volumes detailing faraway lands, strange customs, and the bustling life of exotic ports. These books offered a profound intellectual escape from the confines of the rock. The keeper, unable to physically travel, could instead immerse himself in the detailed, precise language of a Victorian explorer, feeling the dry heat of a distant desert or the thick humidity of a jungle through the texture of the paper. Did the keeper ever find himself distracted during the watch, momentarily forgetting his duty because the pages of a history book had transported him so entirely away from the cold reality of the ocean? The logbooks offer no answer, but the profound engagement with these complex subjects suggests that the mind demanded a complete, all-consuming journey to survive the stillness. The books read in the shadow were not simply time fillers. They were mental anchors. They provided structure and complexity that the monotonous hours otherwise lacked. The sound of the waves gently pulling back from the rock was constant, but the story inside the book was always moving forward, carrying the keeper's mind with it. The reading during the longest watches developed its own unique etiquette. The keeper had to manage the challenge of reading a book while remaining acutely aware of his professional duty. His eyes would move across the faintly reflective page, but his ears would remain attuned to the subtle shifts in the wind's pitch or the unexpected rhythm of the waves. The light from his small lamp would cast a private, shifting circle of illumination, a pool of focus amidst the surrounding dark. It is in the archival evidence of the books themselves that we find the most intimate clues. Researchers have cataloged the physical wear on the returned volumes. The books most frequently read during the night watches, the histories, the essays, the biographies, show a characteristic type of damage. Faint, oily smudges on the bottom edges of the pages. These smudges were left by the keeper's unclean fingers, frequently adjusting the light mechanism or trimming the lamp wick before returning to the text. The presence of these marks is a tactile confirmation of the dual, concurrent duties of the keeper. Another popular genre for the deepest night was high-level philosophical debate. Texts by Emerson, Kant, and Carlyle were frequent requests. These works, requiring intense concentration and offering no easy answers, were ideal for the long hours of solitude. The keeper had no one to argue with, so he engaged in a silent, internal dialogue with the greatest minds in history. One particularly striking archival finding involves the margins of a returned book on European philosophy from a Great Lakes station. Instead of notes or underlines, the keeper had used the wide, blank margins to sketch out small complex geometric designs and mathematical equations. Completely unrelated to the text was the keeper, struggling to follow the philosophical arguments using the calm, precise logic of mathematics as an intellectual release valve. Or did the combination of the philosopher's profound abstraction and the keeper's physical isolation somehow trigger a need for the objective, crystalline order of pure mathematics? The dry pencil scratches on the page offer no answer, but they illustrate the fierce, varied intensity of the keeper's mental activity during the quiet hours. The choice of reading material was also influenced by the sheer scale of the loneliness. The keepers needed books that were immersive and lengthy, texts that were almost inexhaustible. A novel that could be finished in a single night was a dangerous disappointment. They preferred the heavy, doorstop volumes that promised sustained, prolonged company, ensuring that the gentle sound of the turning page would be a feature of many successive midnight watches. The study in shadows reveals that the darkest hours were not wasted. They were fiercely protected hours of self-improvement. The keeper, denied social discourse, found a surrogate parliament and university in his carefully chosen annual box of 50 books. His mind was a quiet engine, fueled by the light of the lamp and the ideas on the page. As the night wore on, moving closer to the cold, distant promise of dawn, the type of reading often shifted subtly. The early hours were for duty and complexity. The hours just before sunrise were often reserved for memory and reflection. The keeper would sometimes set aside the challenging philosophy and reach instead for a volume of poetry or essays, texts that were shorter, more emotional, and more conducive to quiet contemplation. This shift was a quiet acknowledgement of the psychological toll of the longest watches. The keeper needed comfort, but a specific intellectual comfort. He needed verses that dealt with resilience, nature, and the quiet dignity of labor. He would read the poem slowly, often aloud in a low whisper, allowing the vibrations of his own voice to break the oppressive stillness. The archived circulation records show that the poetry volumes were often the most heavily used, yet the least damaged by oil and work. They were treated with a specific delicate reverence, suggesting they were saved for the purest, quietest moments of reflection, when the keeper had completed his last check of the lamp and was simply waiting for the first pale sliver of light to appear on the horizon. The keeper's connection to the text was deeply personal, evidenced by how they marked their place. While using a bookmark was common, the most revealing habit was the soft, almost invisible fold placed in the corner of a page. This was not a quick dog ear. It was a gentle, temporary crease placed with intentionality. What quiet significance did a keeper assign to the single line of poetry that he subtly folded into the corner of the page, intending to revisit it during the next long watch? The historical evidence suggests that these folds marked moments of profound resonance, passages that perfectly articulated the keeper's own unspoken feelings of loneliness, duty, or wonder. The folded corner was a quiet form of self-documentation, a moment when the text ceased to be the author's and became purely the keeper's own. He was archiving his emotional life within the pages of the circulating library. The faint sound of the page unfolding. The next night was the sound of the keeper returning to a conversation he had started with himself a day earlier. The study in shadows ultimately confirms the keeper's great success. He survived the psychological challenge not by abandoning his duties, but by transforming his solitude into an unparalleled opportunity for intellectual growth. He turned the darkest hours into his own private library time, where the rhythmic light of the lamp and the constant pull of the sea became the hypnotic soundtrack to his intense, Quiet reading, the books he read, the history, the philosophy, and the gentle poetry, were the true guardians of the light, ensuring that the keeper's mind remained as bright and true as the beam he cast across the water. This quiet resilience and the small, intimate secrets left on the page lead us to the next discovery, examining the unexpected role of human emotion in these isolated environments. As the deepest hours gave way to the slow, ambient transformation toward dawn, the keeper's focus would often return to the practical, but with a deeper sense of context instilled by the night's reading. The faint smell of wood smoke rising from the fire used to heat the lens mechanism would mingle with the dry scent of the paper still open on his stool. The study in shadows taught him that his small, repetitive duties were part of a vast, ongoing human narrative. He would look up from the dense pages of Roman history or the complex arguments of a philosopher and regard the sweeping beam of his light with renewed perspective. The light was no longer just a mechanical duty. It was a symbol of civilization, a continuation of the same human effort to maintain order against chaos that he had just been reading about. His lonely tower was not an endpoint, but a critical link in the long chain of human progress. The books were not simply a way to pass the time until the watch ended. They were a way to elevate the purpose of the watch itself. They transformed the solitary laborer into a thoughtful participant in history. The keeper learned to recognize the specific sound that signaled the end of his longest watch. The subtle, almost imperceptible change in the quality of the wind's sound as the temperature shifted, or the sudden sharp cry of the first morning seabird. These were the sounds of the world turning back toward life, signaling the time to close the book and perform the final, required tasks of the night. What was the last thought the keeper had as he closed the worn cover of his book? A final reflection on the philosophy he had engaged with, or simply a deep, quiet gratitude for the story that had carried him through the darkness? The logbooks once again offer only the official record, light secured, mechanism clean, relieved by Assistant Keeper Jones. The final, profound emotional movement is left unspoken, preserved only in the faint indentation left on the page where the keeper's finger had rested during his final minutes of reading. The quiet discipline of reading during the longest watches was the keeper's quiet masterpiece. It ensured that when the sun finally rose, the light of his mind was as bright and clear as the beam of his lamp. His secret library, studied in the shadows, proved that even in the greatest isolation, the human spirit is fiercely determined to be nourished. This intense yet quiet, intellectual devotion ensured that the keeper's emotional life remained vibrant, setting the stage for the stories of quiet human emotion found hiding in the margins of the circulating collections. The fog did not arrive with a sound, but with an immense, palpable silence. It crept in from the sea heavy and damp, muffling the constant crash of the waves and wrapping the tower in a thick insulating blanket. The keeper knew this meteorological event was the greatest threat not to the hull of a ship, but to the fragile inner workings of his own mind. This deep, persistent stillness was the fog of boredom, and the books were his only defense. The Lighthouse Board, in their dry, bureaucratic wisdom, referred to the psychological struggle of isolation as simply morale challenges. But the keepers knew it was a war against time itself. Time, isolated on a rock, became viscous and slow, stretching minutes into hours and hours into an almost unbearable loop of repetition. The human mind craves novelty, and the tower offered none. It was during these periods of heavy fog, when the deep, low pulse of the foghorn became the only sound to pierce the silence, that the literary resistance began its quiet work. The books were not merely diversions. They were active weapons against the slow erosion of the intellect. They forced the mind to move, to track characters, to follow arguments, and to construct new worlds, all while the physical body remained confined and still. Imagine the keeper, sitting in the watchroom, the light mechanism ticking patiently above him, holding a volume of poetry. The smooth, cool texture of the paper under his thumb was the only physical reality that offered complexity. He read a poem not just once but many times, slowly turning the phrases over in his mind, using the precision of the language to counteract the vagueness of the surrounding gray air. The fog made the world disappear, reducing everything to the keeper's immediate, sterile environment. The books, however, had the opposite effect. They expanded the world to infinity. A worn copy of Plutarch's Lives transported him across oceans and centuries, filling the tower with the clamor of ancient Roman politics and the sound of distant battle cries. The true genius of the Lighthouse library system was that it understood that escape was not enough. The mind needed structure for that escape. The thick volumes of history and philosophy provided an intellectual scaffolding, a necessary architecture against the formless, crushing weight of the boredom. Did the keeper intentionally choose the most challenging, complex book in the box during the longest fog siege, knowing that the difficulty itself would provide the most intense engagement and resistance? The archival evidence suggests yes. The harder the intellectual challenge, the stronger the defense against the inertia of the mind. The books became silent, reliable companions who never judged the keeper's solitude. They were always ready to offer a new thought, a fresh argument, or a vast, sprawling landscape. The keeper's hand guiding the pages moved with purpose, ensuring that the light of his mind remained bright, even when the light of the sun was entirely obscured by the persistent, suffocating fog. The keeper's resistance through literature manifested in both quiet study and passionate argument. The most intensely read books in the circulating collections were often those that presented a strong, debatable point of view. A book on political theory or a dense volume of economic critique would spark a flurry of mental activity. Since the keeper had no one else to argue with, he often argued with the book itself. He would pace the small circular room, the soft friction of his boots on the stone floor accompanying his silent rebuttal. The intellectual energy generated by this solitary argument was a vital, necessary release from the oppressive stillness. The book became a sparring partner, ensuring the keeper's wit remained sharp, his opinions challenged, and his mind fully engaged. The very act of turning the page was an act of quiet, domestic rebellion. It was a refusal to submit to the mind-numbing repetition of the daily watch. The keeper, holding the book close, could feel the vibration of the foghorn in the granite, but he could feel the stronger, more compelling vibration of the story in his hands. The archival evidence confirms this fierce engagement. Some of the library boxes contained reference books, often a small, well-thumbed dictionary or a compact encyclopedia. These books, while not providing escape, were crucial for maintaining the quality of the intellectual resistance. Why would a keeper, miles from a formal education, constantly refer to a dictionary while reading a philosophical text? It wasn't merely about vocabulary. It was about precision. The keeper, isolated from conversation, used the dictionary to ensure his internal intellectual world remained exact and ordered. He was fighting the linguistic sloppiness that isolation often breeds. The dry, thin texture of the dictionary pages holds the record of a disciplined mind determined to preserve the clarity of its thought. Using the reference book as an intellectual anchor, the dictionary was the ultimate tool against the fog of boredom, ensuring that the keeper's language, and therefore his mind, did not drift into confusion. The books were successful because they provided sustained purpose. Unlike other forms of temporary distraction, the library required effort, commitment, and time. All resources the keeper had in abundance, He turned his greatest vulnerability, his solitude, into his greatest strength, transforming the tower into a school, a parliament, and a quiet sanctuary. The silent pages of fiction and philosophy were the only true weapons against the profound, terrifying silence of the sea. The literary resistance was a quiet, profound victory, proving that the human spirit, when supplied with the right tools, will always fight back against the darkness, maintaining the inner light with the same fierce dedication they used to maintain the tower's beam. This success leads us directly to the quiet, human consequences of such resilience. Let us move now from the grand external drama of the sea and the light, and turn our focus inward, to the quiet, fragile world of human emotion. The circulating library books were meant to connect the keeper to civilization, but sometimes they connected two hearts separated by vast distances and the rigid lines of duty. Our search takes us into the margins of the unexpected novel. The book is an unassuming volume, a popular, slightly worn work of Victorian fiction, perhaps a tale of manners and morality, chosen by the silent selector for its dependable narrative structure. It was a book that offered pleasant escape but promised no deep complexity. Yet it is within this very predictability that a quiet, profound secret was left behind. Imagine the book's journey. It travels from the supply depot to a lighthouse on the Gulf Coast, where it is read intensely for a year. It returns, is cleaned, and is then shipped to a station on the Great Lakes, where it is read just as intensely by a completely different keeper. The faint, dry scent of salt and lake water now clings to the pages, a testament to its travel. It is during the archival inspection of the returned volumes that researchers found the clues. They were not looking for official stamps or inventory numbers, but for the faintest pencil marks, the traces of human thought left behind. The majority of these marks were simple underlinings of important historical dates or philosophical phrases. But in a few novels, the markings were different. They were intimate, subtle, and dangerously revealing. The margins of the unexpected novel held a quiet conversation. The first clue was a series of tiny, almost imperceptible pencil dots placed next to specific, emotionally charged words: courage, lonely, wait, fire. These dots did not appear to be mistakes. They were deliberate marks placed with a fine, sharp point, serving as a private, coded form of emphasis. They appeared on pages describing scenes of yearning or separated lovers. Was this a keeper, reading the novel alone during the midnight watch, highlighting words that precisely articulated his own unexpressed sorrow? Or was something more profound taking place, a silent, coded message intended for a future, unknown reader? The narrative of the book itself focused on a heroine separated from her forbidden love by social class. The keeper who marked these words was using the printed text as a mirror for his own predicament, or perhaps for a secret, unsanctioned relationship he maintained in defiance of the board's strict rules on solitude. The isolation of the tower became not just a physical barrier, but a romantic one. The discovery of the tiny dots transformed the otherwise ordinary novel from a piece of circulating property into a profound, intimate artifact of human longing. The soft, yellowed pages held the secrets of a heart that refused to be contained by the granite walls of the tower. This quiet conversation, conducted entirely in marginalia, was the only tangible evidence of a love that the bureaucratic system was designed to prevent. The most compelling finding about the unexpected novel emerged when the book was tracked to its second and third readers. The pencil dots were, in fact, not random. They were a deliberate code. In the margins of the same pages that featured the original dots, the second reader had responded, not with more dots, but with small, faint check marks, placed slightly lower on the page. If the first keeper's dots highlighted words like courage and lonely, The second keeper's checkmarks appeared next to words like patience and tomorrow. This was a quiet, profound act of literary correspondence. Two keepers, separated by hundreds of miles and years of duty, were using the novel as their only highly risky means of communication, a conversation about forbidding love and patient waiting. How did the second keeper know the dots were not random marks, but the opening lines of a secret dialogue? The archival researchers speculate that the forbidden romance was not with a person on the mainland, but between two assistant keepers who had served together and were then forcibly separated by transfer. Their only shared space was the circulating library. Their only means of conversation was the novel itself, passed between them by the entirely unaware Lighthouse board tender. This use of the novel as a clandestine post office meant that every scene of the book took on a double meaning. A description of a hidden garden became a metaphor for their secret love. A chapter detailing a difficult journey became a symbol of their separation. The soft, pliable paper of the book became the keeper's most trusted confidant. The risk involved in this communication was immense. If the supply depot clerk, the silent selector, had noticed the pattern of the dots and check marks, the book would have been immediately withdrawn and destroyed. The lover's secret would have been lost and perhaps their professional lives jeopardized. This danger lent a profound, quiet tension to the act of reading. It is on the final, brittle flyleaf of the unexpected novel that the most intimate clue was discovered. Written in a tiny, almost vanished hand, separate from the text were two simple, barely legible initials, followed by a specific date. The initials were different, representing the two individuals who had shared this dangerous secret. The date recorded was not a delivery date, but a date in the future, a projected date of reunion, a time when the keeper's term of service would end. This small faded pencil mark was the ultimate act of hope, a testament to the fact that the human heart, when faced with overwhelming isolation, will always find a way to communicate its truth. The quiet drama of the unexpected novel confirms that the circulating libraries did more than sustain the keepers' minds. They protected their hearts. The books, intended to enforce order and duty, became the silent vehicles for forbidden romance, proving that the most powerful force on the coast was not the wind or the waves, but the enduring, quiet need for connection. The sound of the sea was the keeper's daughter's earliest language. It was a constant hushing roar that filled the lower rooms of the tower, and the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the lamp's clockwork mechanism was her first school bell. Education on a remote, wave-swept rock was a challenge the Lighthouse board had not fully solved. Yet the circulating library boxes offered an accidental, powerful solution. Imagine a little girl, confined to the small, circular world of the lighthouse base, her view of the world restricted to the immense, indifferent ocean and the gleaming, silent efficiency of her father's brass instruments. There was no schoolhouse, no classroom, and no other children. Her teacher was the relentless routine of the tower, and her curriculum was carried by the sea. The library box, when it arrived, was her schoolhouse door. For the keeper's wife, ensuring her children received an education was a constant, profound worry, documented in the faint, worried script of letters sent back to the mainland. But within the annual list of 50, carefully curated by the distant, silent selector, were a handful of volumes specifically intended for the keeper's family. These books were her education by seafaring mail. They were often thick, simplified histories, volumes of practical arithmetic, and detailed books on geography and natural science. She would handle them with an intensity that mainland children, drowning in printed abundance, could never know. The rough, durable cloth binding of her geography book felt like a promise that the world was larger than the circle of light cast by her father's lamp. She learned her fractions by watching her father measure the precise amounts of oil for the lamp, She learned geometry by studying the perfect curving spiral of the iron staircase that led up to the lantern room, and she learned everything else. The names of distant cities, the dates of ancient wars, the principles of chemistry, from the books that arrived smelling faintly of kerosene and salt water. The printed word, delivered across miles of hostile water, became the most powerful force for normalcy in her life. It was a lifeline to the culture and opportunity she was geographically denied. Her solitude was not a barrier to knowledge, but perhaps a peculiar incubator for it. Did the quiet intensity of the tower, with its singular focus and lack of distraction, allow the keeper's daughter to absorb the printed word with greater focus and depth than her mainland peers? The archival silence offers no direct answer, but the stories of later achievements by these solitary students suggest a powerful truth. The lack of noise amplified the power of the text. The most compelling archival evidence of this secluded education is found not in official school records, which were non-existent, but in the wear patterns on the returned juvenilia. The children's books, unlike the keeper's technical manuals, often showed signs of being read and reread with a fierce, possessive love. Pages were soft, almost velvety to the touch, from excessive handling. Imagine a book on botany, detailing the structure of flowers and trees. To the keeper's daughter, these descriptions were not abstract. They were profound acts of revelation. She lived in a world dominated by granite, ocean, and sky. The book showed her the lush, secret complexity of the earth she could not touch. Her father might bring her a piece of driftwood or a fragment of seaweed, but the book gave her the names, the structure, and the entire ecosystem she was missing. The Lighthouse board, in their meticulous inventory, sometimes noted that certain volumes were too damaged for further circulation, a quiet testament to the sheer, relentless hunger of a lonely child for a story. These books were not carelessly destroyed. They were consumed, worn out by repetition and intense focus. The physical lighthouse itself became an object lesson inspired by the books. A volume on optical science intended for the keeper might be appropriated by his daughter. She would sit in the lantern room, watching the great Fresnel lens slowly turn, using the light refracted through the glass prisms to visualize the concepts of light, convergence, and power she had just read about. Her science textbook was the single, immense machine that kept her safe. One surviving letter from a keeper in the Florida Keys notes that his daughter learned to identify every constellation by using the star charts found in a celestial navigation book, the only window in the tower offering an uninterrupted view of the night sky. She learned the precise, formal names of the stars, transforming the distant, cold expanse into a familiar, orderly map. This solitary, intellectual immersion produced a unique psychological profile. A child with an encyclopedic knowledge drawn entirely from the printed word, yet entirely innocent of social complexity. She spoke the language of history, poetry, and science, but not the casual, shifting dialects of the mainland schoolyard. Did the deep, constant sound of the ocean which framed her reading hours shape the rhythm of her internal dialogue, making her sentences longer, more rhythmic, and more profoundly reflective? Her vocabulary was built not on quick social interactions, but on the precise measured power of the authors delivered by seafaring mail. The sheer value of a book was amplified by the scarcity. Every new volume in the annual box was a feast, a new friend, and a promise that the world was still out there, waiting patiently for her return. The power of the printed word in the keeper's tower was that it provided a stable, continuous intellectual presence in a life defined by instability and isolation. The weather was volatile, the boat trips irregular, and visitors non-existent, but the knowledge contained within the pages was constant, patient, and always accessible. The keeper's daughter's education was self-driven and intensely concentrated. She learned the discipline of deep, sustained reading, a skill that many mainland children, easily distracted by their bustling environment, often failed to acquire. She had the time and she had the profound need. The book was her only window, and she pressed her face to it for hours. In some rare archival correspondence from the Lighthouse service, there is a reference to a keeper's daughter who, upon leaving the tower and enrolling in a mainland school, was placed years ahead of her age group in history and literature. Her knowledge of complex subjects, drawn from the dense volumes intended for her father, was vast. She was intellectually armored by the isolation that was meant to crush her spirit. This phenomenon highlights the quiet heroism of the keeper's wife, who was the true, unsung librarian and teacher. She managed the annual circulation, determined the appropriate texts, and guided her daughter through the long, often difficult philosophical or scientific passages. She was the one who ensured that the seafaring male translated into genuine education. The language of the books she read was formal, often dense with vocabulary. The keeper's daughter, unable to ask a teacher for clarification, had to resolve every unknown word through effort, either by consulting her father's dictionary or by attempting to decipher the meaning through the surrounding context. Did this necessity for self-reliance in learning create an intellect that was not just knowledgeable, but profoundly resilient, unafraid of difficulty and accustomed to solving intellectual problems entirely alone? This necessity for deep engagement is the psychological legacy of the Lighthouse library system. The very lack of human input forced a richer, more profound interaction with the text. The words on the page were not polluted by the biases or limitations of a single teacher. They were raw, authoritative knowledge that she internalized and integrated with the massive, natural lessons of the sea. She was being educated by the immense rhythmic silence of the tower itself, curated by the power of the printed word. The books became her anticipation of the future. By reading about cities, schools, and social life, she was quietly preparing herself for a world she had never seen, a world that the Lighthouse Board, in its duty to national safety, had temporarily deferred. As the keeper's daughter grew, the library books ceased being mere curriculum and transformed into trusted, cherished companions. The power of the printed word provided her with an identity that transcended the simple designation of the girl who lives in the lighthouse. She became the reader, the historian, the silent student of the stars and the sea. Her quiet immersion in the literature of the circulating library meant that when she finally left the tower, she carried a unique perspective. She was deeply familiar with the grand sweep of human endeavor, the complex arguments of philosophy, and the intricate structure of the natural world, all acquired in the shadow of the guiding light. The books had given her a profound, quiet confidence. The final trace of her unusual education is often found in the return logbooks. Sometimes the keeper would note that a certain book had been signed out of the collection by the daughter, not returned, with a small notation, retained for personal study, cost deducted from salary. This small, quiet transaction, the exchange of a year's wages for a single, beloved volume, is the most powerful testament to the power of the printed word delivered by seafaring mail. The book was no longer circulating property. It was a permanent artifact of her hard-won intellectual freedom. The keeper's daughter's story is the enduring, soft promise of the circulating libraries, that no matter how distant the rock, no matter how severe the isolation, human curiosity and the need for knowledge will always find a way to thrive, sustained by the gentle cargo of a small, wooden box arriving once a year bearing the faint, dry scent of paper and ink. The sound of the sea, usually a rhythmic backdrop, shifts during a storm. It becomes a deep, hungry roar, a vast resonant sound that shakes the very granite base of the tower. We are transported now to a moment of quiet crisis in the late 1880s, documented in a single surviving telegram and a handwritten logbook entry. This is the story of the Great Storm Delivery, a moment of profound historical irony, where intellectual sustenance outweighed physical necessity. A hurricane was sweeping up the coast, its wind tearing at the waves and turning the water into a churning, chaotic expanse of gray. The lighthouse in question, a remote, exposed station, had already been without a supply tender for 6 weeks due to earlier poor weather. Their reserves of kerosene were low, their fresh water was rationed, and their food stores were becoming dangerously depleted. The duty of the keeper was becoming a matter of survival, not just vigilance. The lighthouse board, receiving desperate messages from the keeper, dispatched a tender for an emergency drop of essential supplies: oil, water, and dried provisions. The captain of the tender knew the risk. Navigating the churning waters was hazardous, and transferring supplies onto the wave-battered rock would be immensely difficult, requiring immense skill and speed. Now, imagine the two separate realities converging. The keeper, watching the sea foam rage against the tower, was focused on the immediate, desperate need for more fuel for the lamp, the light that kept him alive. The tender captain, focused on his manifest, knew that every inch of cargo space was critical. Yet despite the emergency, despite the immediate threat of starvation or darkness, the inventory list for the emergency drop included a circulating library box. This was Box 19F, designated for the keeper's annual literary refreshment. The silent selector back in New York had prioritized the box's rotation, not realizing the magnitude of the supply crisis. When the tender reached the station, battling the strong cold spray and the powerful currents, the crew's attention was entirely on the heavy, essential items: the drums of oil, the canvas sacks of flour. The keeper, struggling to secure the heavy lines, was expecting only life-saving supplies. But when the cargo was finally transferred, hauled up by pulley in a brief, terrifying lull between waves there, nestled amongst the oil cans and the dry rations, was the wooden box containing the list of 50. It was heavy, dense, and utterly non-essential to the immediate task of survival. It contained books of history, philosophy, and a collection of Charles Dickens's latest work. Could the keeper, standing there battered by the wind, genuinely feel a surge of relief at the sight of a box of Dickens, knowing his lamp oil was still desperately low? The archival records hint at a profound, quiet moment of cognitive dissonance, a collision between bureaucratic procedure and human desperation. The moment proved that, in the eyes of the distant board, the psychological armor provided by literature was as vital to the keeper's duty as the physical fuel for his light. A human mind broken by boredom and hopelessness could extinguish the light just as surely as a lack of oil. The keeper's logbook entry for that day, written in a cramped, shaky hand due to the lingering exhaustion and the relentless howl of the wind, records the official supplies first. Received 2 drums kerosene, 1 sack beans. Water filter functional. The critical items were noted with professional precision, but then, separated by a line break, came the note about the unexpected cargo. Box 19F received. Contained new books including works by Dickens. No immediate need for reading, yet presence is noted. The phrase "no immediate need for reading" is the profound understatement of the archive. He was acknowledging the irony, the absurdity of receiving intellectual fuel when physical fuel was scarce. Yet, the logbook entry confirms that the books were recognized as a necessary part of the inventory, even in extremis. They were a commitment from the mainland that the keeper's life was not meant to be reduced solely to duty and maintenance. The heavy, dry weight of the box, smelling of new paper and clean binding, stood as a silent promise that the world beyond the storm still valued his mind. This incident, however, also reveals a subtle act of quiet defiance by the keeper. The supplies received were enough to sustain the light for a few more weeks, but not enough to remove the sense of constant peril. The keeper had to prioritize, and he made the choice to prioritize his children's well-being. According to later oral history interviews with the keeper's family, the first thing opened after the food and oil was not a can of beans, but the library box. The keeper's daughter, confined to the base of the tower and terrified by the unrelenting roar of the storm, was quickly becoming hysterical. The constant deafening sound of the wind, the vibrations of the granite, and the anxiety of her parents were overwhelming. The keeper, having secured the lamp and checked the dwindling oil, pulled the box of books open. He did not reach for the technical manual, but for the thickest, most absorbing novel in the collection, the new volume of Dickens. He sat his daughter down near the warm, hissing heat of the stove and began to read aloud, allowing the measured, melodic flow of Dickens's language to provide a counter-rhythm to the chaotic sound of the storm outside. Did the keeper instinctively understand that the existential fear caused by the great storm could only be fought not by logic or supplies, but by the profound escapism of a compelling story? The historical irony is complete. The books, seemingly the most dispensable cargo, became the most vital piece of psychological survival equipment. The box of Dickens was literally more important than additional food, because it provided the only tool capable of fighting the deep, internal fear that threatened to extinguish the light of the keeper's mind and the sanity of his family. We return, now, to the stillness of the archive, to the great heavy ledgers that document the quiet life and eventual disappearance of the Lighthouse library system. Let your attention settle on a single book, the final circulation ledger for the Northeast District, bound in dark, scuffed leather, its pages brittle with age. This book holds the record of a closing era, preserved in fading inscription and the meticulous hand of the final clerk. The Lighthouse library system did not end with a sudden dramatic announcement. It dissolved slowly, quietly, rendered obsolete by the very progress it was meant to sustain. The invention of the incandescent light replaced oil lamps. Improved radio communications replaced months of isolation, and better roads and faster boats meant keepers and their families were no longer prisoners of the rock. Civilization was finally catching up to the lonely towers. As modernization swept the coast, the annual tender stops became more frequent, and supplies became less critical. The need for the highly structured annual dose of 50 pre-selected books began to wane. Keepers could now request specific texts or even bring their own personal collections with less logistical difficulty. The necessity of the seafaring mail was ending. The final ledger documents this transition with dry, bureaucratic neutrality. Page after page, we see the entries change. Where a keeper once requested complex philosophical text for the longest watches, the new entries show simple requests for magazines or mainland newspapers. Quick, disposable media replacing the heavy, sustained engagement of the circulating books. The demand for deep intellectual immersion was being replaced by the demand for immediate information. The hand of the clerk who penned these final entries is precise, almost painfully neat, as if trying to impose order on a system that was gently dissolving. We turn to the final active page of the ledger, noting the very last box to be logged into the system. It is box 72K, sent in the early 1930s to a station in the Pacific Northwest. The last entry in the Lighthouse Library ledger records the contents of this box: 1 volume on diesel engines, 1 volume on radio signaling, and 48 assorted novels and histories. The entry is signed, dated, and marked with the precise weight of the box. But beneath this official notation, the clerk, perhaps feeling the quiet weight of the historical moment, added a tiny personal flourish. Did the final clerk, whose job was to log the end of this quiet era, feel a sense of relief that the keepers were no longer so profoundly isolated, or a quiet nostalgia for the disciplined, thoughtful reading that isolation had enforced? The system was ending because life was getting easier, but a small quiet sadness accompanies the closing of this chapter. The profound intellectual connection between the silent selector and the isolated reader was no longer necessary. The sound of the softly closing ledger is the sound of a beautiful human solution to a cold, hard problem, finally rendered obsolete. The final inscription holds the true emotional resonance of the archive. Once Box 72K was sent out, the ledger was officially closed. No more boxes would be prepared. No more new books would be purchased for circulation. The physical ledger, with its hundreds of pages of fading inscription detailing the long journeys of the books, was formally retired. The very last inscription in the entire book is not related to Box 72K. It is written on the final, otherwise blank flyleaf, a place where official notes were never intended to appear. It is penned in a hand that is slightly older, perhaps the hand of a senior supervisor who had overseen the entire lifespan of the system. This final inscription is a single sentence, written in a clear, measured script and then underlined twice. The work of the light is measured in miles. The work of the book is measured in lives. This final entry is a quiet, powerful acknowledgement that the system was never just about logistics or literacy. It was about preserving the human soul against the unique psychological assault of isolation. The supervisor, making his unauthorized final mark on the archive, summarized the entire decades-long effort with simple, profound irony. He recognized that the books, the most fragile and non-essential cargo, were the true lifesavers. After the official end, the library books themselves gradually disappeared. Some were retained by keepers, forever cherished as artifacts of their long duty. Many were simply left behind as the towers were automated or abandoned, their bindings dissolving in the persistent damp of the abandoned rooms. The only thing that remains is the collective memory, the ghost of the logbook, the quiet knowledge that for decades a remote bureaucracy created one of the most effective, compassionate systems for mental health maintenance in American history. It was a silent testament to the belief that human dignity required story and philosophy as much as it required oil and water. As the last library book slowly decomposed on the abandoned shelves, did the wind and the waves carry the final, quiet echoes of the keeper's voice, reading his favorite poem aloud one last time before automation took over? We can imagine the soft turning of invisible pages in the still, abandoned towers. The fading inscription marks the end of the system, but the beginning of its legacy. It reminds us that when we seek to understand history, we must look beyond the grand structures and the official pronouncements, and look instead for the small, quiet records of human empathy, the single handwritten sentence that summarized a world of work. The light continues to turn, now automated and efficient, but the quiet, intense devotion of the keeper and his reliance on the power of the printed word remains the most beautiful part of the tower's long, lonely story. The sound of the light has changed. The rhythmic, mechanical tick-tock of the old clockwork is gone, replaced by the low, subtle hum of automated sensors and electrical efficiency. The kerosene lamps are gone, and the great glass prisms of the Fresnel lens are tended only by circuits and timers. The modern lighthouse is a precise, solitary machine, performing its duty perfectly without the aid or the emotional baggage of human hands. We are walking now through an abandoned tower, where the light is automated and the keeper's quarters are empty. This is the realm of the ghost of a reader. What remains of the decades of intellectual struggle and quiet human life that unfolded within these circular walls? When the books are gone, retained, lost, or decayed, and the light is automated, all that is left is the imprint of intention. We are searching for the subtle scent of history that lingers in the dust. In the small main floor room that once served as the keeper's study and the family's library, the atmosphere is cool and static. The salt-laden air has scoured the walls, and the shelves where the circulating library boxes once rested are bare. Yet, if you look closely at the wooden surface of the shelf, you can still perceive a slight fading circular mark, the ghost outline left behind by the repeated placement of the heavy, annual library box. This faint stain is an archival echo. It marks the precise spot where knowledge, hope, and the mainland's compassion arrived every year. The smooth wood where the keeper's hand rested as he selected his reading material retains the memory of his patient choice. The work of automation was swift and efficient. The final keeper packed his bags, performed his last duties, and left the tower to the solitude of its circuits. But no machine can erase the profound human energy left behind. We search the corners, the spaces between the floorboards, the tiny ledges near the windows where the keeper might have rested his lamp. And sometimes we find a small, quiet artifact, a piece of faded pencil lead, snapped perhaps during the underlining of a profound passage in a difficult philosophical text, or a tiny brass collar that fell off the lamp wick trimmer decades ago. These fragments are the quiet physical remnants of a fierce, sustained intellectual life. Did the final keeper, upon leaving the tower and looking back at the automated beam, feel relieved by the freedom? Or did he feel a profound sense of loss for the intense, singular purpose that the light and the books had provided? The automation solved the logistical problem of the coast, but it destroyed the unique psychological environment that had forced such deep intellectual engagement. The absence of the books is the clearest marker of this change. Where once the keeper had to rely on Plutarch and Dickens to fill the vast silence, the automated light now relies on silence alone. The most compelling remnant of the ghost of a reader is found not in the physical objects, but in the texture of the silence itself. The stillness of the automated tower is different from the silence of the staffed tower. The earlier silence was full of potential, the potential for reading, for thought, for the subtle sound of the keeper's whispered argument with a book. The new silence is empty, metallic, and final. Yet if we allow our minds to settle, we can sense the persistent spiritual residue of the long watches. We can almost perceive the impression left by the keeper's heavy, salt-stained boots on the stone steps of the circular staircase, and the faint warmth that radiated from the small oil lamp where he sat reading history and poetry. The lighthouse stands now as a silent monument to human discipline. The light it casts is cold and perfect, but the light it remembered was warm and flawed. A kerosene lamp that required constant trimming and polishing, fueled not only by oil but by the fierce intellectual will of the man who tended it. The books may be gone, scattered into history, but the underlining remains, archived within the pages of the returned ledgers. The words that the keepers found resonant, phrases about resilience, loneliness, and the beauty of human connection are the true, enduring, fading inscription of the library system. Even in the most sterilized, automated towers, there is a distinct, almost imperceptible scent that resists erasure. It is not the clean smell of electricity, but a complex, subtle aroma, a faint mixture of dry paper, mineral oil, polished brass, and old sea salt. This scent is the ghost of the keeper's daily life, the sensory echo of the very environment that drove him to seek refuge in the circulating libraries. If a keeper returned to his automated tower decades later, would the scent of that lingering history bring him comfort, reminding him of the profound purpose he once possessed? Or would it bring a sharp, sudden pang of the intense solitude he had overcome? The ghost of a reader is the quiet proof that the library succeeded. The books ensured that when the keeper's duty ended and the light was automated, the memory he left behind was one of thoughtful, engaged humanity, not of madness or despair. He left behind a legacy of quiet intellectual achievement, preserved in the shadows and the faint scent of his passing. The tower stands as a symbol of permanent vigilance, but the story of the circulating library is the quiet history of temporary grace, the annual, vital gift that sustained the soul until the machine could take over. And that quiet human history is the most precious light of all. We come now to the final reflective stage of our quiet investigation. The light, once a physical, tangible beam fueled by oil and human labor, has become an abstract symbol of vigilance and hope. The Lighthouse library system is long gone, dissolved into the past, yet its work endures. This is the quiet legacy, the story of the illumination that stretched far beyond the shoreline, reaching into the very lives and minds of the families who maintain the coast. The legacy rests in the profound shift in perspective the books provided. The keeper was tasked with seeing the darkness outside, the danger, the fog, the peril of the shoals. The books, however, forced him to see the light within, the potential for learning, the capacity for emotional resilience, and the vast interior landscape of the human mind. The faint scent of old paper and ink is the lingering memory of this quiet illumination. We often remember the physical bravery of the keepers, their stoicism against the storm. But the truest courage they possessed was intellectual courage, the willingness to use their profound solitude not for despair, but for fierce, intense self-education. They turned the massive, empty structure of the tower into a vertical university, their curriculum delivered by seafaring mail. This quiet commitment left an indelible mark on the coastal communities. The children who grew up with the circulating libraries often carried that intense, singular focus into the mainland world, becoming teachers, engineers, and researchers, minds shaped by the discipline of reading and the deep silence. The soft, rhythmic sound of the ocean waves was the hypnotic soundtrack to their early learning. The most beautiful part of the legacy is the unspoken connection the system fostered. The circulating books were vehicles of empathy, silently connecting keepers across hundreds of miles. The underlined passage in a philosophy text read by a keeper in Maine offered a word of wisdom to a keeper in Texas 2 years later. The faint dried flower pressed into a novel in Oregon offered a glimpse of domestic beauty to a reader in Michigan. Can we truly know the collective mental health saved by these circulating boxes? The marriages preserved by the shared structured reading, or the minds rescued from the spiral of isolation, simply by the promise of a new story arriving next year? The archival silence demands we consider the possibility that the mental health dividends paid by the libraries far outweighed the monetary cost of the oil consumed by the lamps. The quiet legacy is the enduring truth that the human spirit, when constrained by necessity, will achieve intellectual feats of surprising resilience. The libraries illuminated the interior lives of the keepers, proving that the most valuable light cast from the tower was not the one that warned ships away from danger, but the one that illuminated the way toward inner purpose and lasting connection. The legacy endures because the story of the circulating library offers a profound, timeless lesson that solitude and boredom are not simply voids. They are powerful forces that demand structure and intention. The books provided that necessary architecture, transforming the keeper's empty time into his greatest asset. The towers today stand automated and cold, performing their duty with dispassionate efficiency. Yet the history of the Library of Light serves as a vital correction to the cold logic of the machine. It reminds us that human service is defined not just by what is done, but by how the soul is maintained during the doing. The automated light is a marvel of engineering, but the human light, sustained by Dickens and philosophy, was a marvel of the spirit. When the last of the books were retired, lost or retained by keepers, they left behind not just a gap on the shelves, but a hole in the historical narrative of isolation. The loss of the system means we lost that precious, quiet window into the unique intellectual and emotional lives of the people who kept the coasts safe. The fading inscription in the final ledger. The work of the light is measured in miles. The work of the book is measured in lives, is the simple, perfect summary of this legacy. It is the final, unauthorized editorial comment that confirms the book's true value. As we step back from the tower, looking up at the perfect electric beam sweeping the horizon, we can imagine the ghost of a reader looking back at us. That ghost is not a spectral figure, but the enduring image of a human being engaged in deep, thoughtful work, his life given complexity and meaning by the single, steady light of his kerosene lamp and the quiet power of the printed word. The libraries illuminated the shore, guiding ships home through the fog and the storm. But their quiet legacy is the illumination they provided to the human heart, guiding the keepers home to themselves through the far greater, more dangerous fog of isolation. Can we find, in our own busy, noisy lives today, the commitment to deep, focused intellectual engagement that the keepers found in their solitude? Or have we lost the value of the scarce, treasured word? The story ends not with the automation, but with the gentle, rhythmic reminder that the greatest treasures are often the ones we can hold in our hands. A worn volume of history, a familiar collection of poetry, a fragile letter, all quietly delivered across the distance, carrying the light of connection. We come now to the final silence, the moment of quiet reflection after the story has been told and the archives have been closed. The Library of Light is a chapter of history completed, but the feeling it evoked, the enduring comfort of a story found far from shore, is a timeless truth. Let the sound of the distant rhythmic waves guide your thoughts now, as we contemplate the final legacy of those circulating boxes. The essence of the legacy rests in the simple, profound relationship between the keeper, the book, and the vast empty space that separated them. The keeper, confined to his granite tower, found in the story a unique form of freedom. The book was not just paper and ink. It was an intellectual horizon, a boundaryless world that countered the strict physical boundaries of the sea. Imagine the keeper, years after his retirement, sitting in a small, quiet room on the mainland. The chaos of city life would seem loud and meaningless after decades of the sea's steady, honest rhythm. What would he remember most clearly? Not the storms, perhaps, but the quiet discipline of the long watches and the warm, steady light that fell across the page of a cherished novel. The books gave the keeper a special kind of comfort, the comfort of certainty. The world outside the tower was volatile, governed by unpredictable weather and the immense shifting power of the ocean. But the world inside the book was stable. The beginning and the end were known. The characters once understood remained constant. This intellectual certainty was a profound defense against the psychological instability of his isolated life. This comfort was amplified by the scarcity. Unlike today, where 1,000 new ideas clamor for attention, the keeper's list of 50 became intensely familiar. He didn't just read the books. He knew them. He recognized the subtle scent of the paper, the exact sound the binding made when opened to a favorite chapter, and the specific rhythm of the author's voice. Did the keeper find deeper comfort in rereading a familiar history book, or in discovering a new, unknown philosophical argument? The archival evidence suggests the comfort was found in both. The certainty of the familiar story provided an anchor, while the challenge of the new philosophy provided a necessary intellectual workout. Both acts were critical to maintaining the inner light. The keeper understood that true comfort wasn't the absence of challenge, but the presence of reliable structure, a structure that only the printed word could provide. The final legacy of the circulating libraries is the quiet affirmation that empathy can be mechanized. A cold bureaucracy concerned only with safety and statistics inadvertently created one of the most empathetic systems in history, using the simple, honest delivery of a story to protect the minds of the people who protected the coast. The reflections on a shelf lead us to the understanding that the most lasting impact of the system was the deeper sense of meaning it conferred upon the keeper's solitary work. He was not just a mechanic of the light. He was a protector of the human narrative. When he read Dickens or Scott during the midnight watch, he was reminded that his lonely sacrifice was part of a larger, ongoing human drama. The stories confirmed that the civilization he was keeping safe, the complex, often chaotic world of mainland life, was worth the profound isolation he endured. The book was a constant reminder of the value of the things unseen from the tower. Now, decades later, the shelves in the abandoned keeper's quarters are empty. But if you were to stand in that quiet room, you might still feel the profound stillness of concentration, the residual energy left behind by a mind fully engaged. That is the true ghost of the reader, the memory of attention. The final, gentle comfort of the story is the knowledge that the solitude was never total. The keeper far from shore was never truly alone. He was accompanied by the voices of the philosophers, the poets, the historians, and the silent selector who chose them. His library was his bridge, and every page he turned was a step toward the mainland. The light turns on automatically now, cold and efficient, but the enduring light is the one that was kindled by the power of the printed word, the illumination that reached far beyond the shoreline and sustained the deepest reaches of the human heart.